Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Illustration Department Podcast. My name is Giuseppe Castellano. In this podcast, I talk to folks in illustration, graphic design, publishing, animation, and other creative fields about their work, the lessons they've learned, and the bumps and bruises they've experienced along the way. In this episode, my guest is Sam Viviano, award-winning cartoonist and former art director of Mad magazine. As an illustrator, there is always something to worry about. But what you worry about should not stop you from what you create. It's easier said than done, I know. Among other topics, Sam talks about his membership in Mad's usual gang of idiots. We discuss what the careers of Norman Mingo and Jack Davis can teach today's illustrators. And Sam reminds creatives, even us worrywarts, why we should keep on keeping on. I hope you enjoy our conversation.
Did you get thrown a loop because Skype was discontinued?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Yeah, I've learned after 5 years that there's only so much you can control, and honestly, only so much that you really need to control.
Yeah, I was going to say, you don't want to control everything because,
I did in the beginning.
It is what it is.
Yeah, I did in the beginning. I really wanted it to sound like a professional, I'm Terry Gross, we're in the NPR studios sound, and then it just, I'm recording in my closet, you're recording in your house, like, whatever, man. It's fine.
Yeah.
I was asked by the Rockwell to come up when you guys did the Mad Magazine exhibition up there.
Last year.
Yeah, last year. I was asked by them to come up and maybe do a little podcasting, a little whatever. And I really wanted to, and I don't honestly remember why I said no, but I declined. And had I not, you and I would have rubbed elbows. It would have been nice.
Yeah. It was a terrific exhibit. I was really tickled to be part of it. Stephanie's really terrific.
Oh, for sure. What was your official title as part of that exhibition? Were you a guest curator, or were you the lead curator?
Lead advisor.
Okay.
The co-curator was Steve Brodner.
Heard of
I
him.
assume you know.
Heard of him.
Steve's if illustration is your purview in this podcast, Steve is an important person to you might want to be talking to. Steve.
Yeah.
Steve's about a year and a half younger than I am, so it means we're basically.
So he's 28.
Yeah, right. He just turned 70, and
Nice.
He's been around a long time. He's very political,
Mm-hmm.
and for a long time he kind of restricted his career to that. Appearing in The Nation and other political venues. Then he became a dad himself and realized he needed to really earn a living. And that's when he exploded, because he was in Entertainment Weekly and Rolling Stone and everywhere. He's taken the Substack route.
Sure.
And he's got a very trenchant Substack. But I mean, I should point out that Steve, last year, not only was he co-curator of the exhibit, and one of the reasons he was picked is that he had a one-man show at the Rockwell Museum about 15 years ago.
Deservedly so.
He was inducted into the Society of Illustrators Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
And he got the Herbert Award for Editorial Cartoonist of the Year. So last year was a big year for him.
Good for him. I don't think I'm ever going to get any awards or anything, and that's another thing I've sort of come to peace with. My podcast doesn't sound exactly how I want. I'm never going to get any awards, and I'm all right with that. I don't know about you, Sam, but the older I get, the more I'm just I just want things to be okay. I just want things to work. I'm not looking for grand experiences anymore. I used to. I don't need it anymore. I don't feel like I need it.
I've gone hot and cold in the whole issue of awards my entire career. Early in the career, I realized that the kind of work I did fell into cracks. Illustrators thought of me as a cartoonist. Cartoonists thought of me as an illustrator. And I would
cartoonists
watch,
and illustrators thought of you as an art director.
Later that happened.
Later
Yeah,
in life. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I've realized that for me, the biggest award I could ask for was that the career kept going, that clients kept coming
There
back
it
to me,
is.
that I
Exactly.
didn't want for work. So, I don't have any complaints on that score. Now, I have gotten two awards. I submitted some work for the Rubens, and I did get what they call a silver Reuben for magazine illustration.
Excellent.
And I realized I don't ever have to submit again because I can now put on my resume I'm an award winning cartoonist. And
Bingo.
I know a number of people who will submit every year in multiple categories. They
Yeah.
want to keep amassing all of these plaques. And I just, and since it's ultimately something of a popularity contest, I like to see my friends win things, but even when I won, I felt I didn't deserve it because it was a year that Bob Stack did that iconic New Yorker cartoon cover
Yeah.
for Obama's election. I don't know if you know that one with the
Oh, I
moon.
not only do I know it, but I talked to Bob Stack on the podcast a couple episodes ago about that very cover.
That was the year he had done that cover. So I said, "Oh, he's a shoe-in." And when I got the thing, I said, okay, I know why. Because I go to the Rubens every year. I know all the people. I'm very friendly.
Yeah.
And, I got it because of that. To be very, I mean, also, and I think this speaks to something you just said, I think a lot of people in the NCS thought of me as the art director of MAD and were kind of surprised when they realized, oh, he can draw too.
Yeah. By the way, for folks who are like NCS and the National Cartoonist Society.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which I always confuse and say the National Society of Cartoonists, which I guess, I don't know, tomato, tomato.
Well,
Not to be confused with NCIS or NCSI. What's that
oh
show
yeah,
called?
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It'd be great if there was a series on TV about the NCS.
Well, my wife and I, we were flipping through the other day and saw a show. It was British about portraitists, and I guess we
Really?
haven't watched the show, but I guess portrait painters compete against each other for the right to do an official portrait, which I think will end up in the Royal Academy Gallery, something something.
So it's a
Fin-
portraiture bake-off.
It's a portraiture bake-off,
Yeah.
a
Okay.
portraiture face-off.
They're fun to watch, but I guess that's the whole point. Art shouldn't be a competition. We
Exactly,
shouldn't be
Sam.
saying, this guy is better than that guy, and she's better than her, and
Right.
so I don't particularly cotton. And even this year, I kind of begged off of being involved in my NCS chapter. They kind of go through a sorting of
Sure.
submissions for various categories. And I said, I hate doing it because you're zipping through people's work, and then you're having to categorize them and say this guy's better than this. I said, I don't want to do it.
Yeah.
So
Well, you kind of had to do it as an art director. I want to get to that later.
okay.
Screw it. We'll get to it now. You kind of had to see. This is about as a professional and whatever as this conversation is going to get. You sort of had to do it as an art director, right? I
Well,
mean,
sort.
illustrators showed you their portfolios, and you had to sort through them, and you had to pick which ones you wanted for
Well,
Mad.
you have to remember that I inherited the position. There were a few art directors before me.
Sure.
Harvey Kurtzman, who created Mad, and John Putnam, who really set the tone for what the magazine became. Lenny Brenner, who was there for close to 50 years. Jonathan Schneider,
Yeah.
and even Nadina Simon, who was this acting art director for a number of months before I signed on. So, when I came aboard too, it wasn't just that I had a stable of artists already. I had a stable of artists that included Mort Drucker and
Mm-hmm.
Paul Coker
Jack
and George
Davis.
Woodbridge and Al Jaffee. No, Davis was gone by the time I came out
Oh, you didn't
aboard.
overlap.
No, Davis at some point decided that he was embarrassed by the work he did for Mad. He had grandchildren and he didn't want them seeing the stuff. And
Okay.
the only time I worked with Jack was after Dave Berg died, who did the lighter side, and we had a number of scripts, and we decided to let the other artist illustrate Berg's strips that he didn't get a chance to do.
Right.
So I called Jack. I said, it's a tribute to Dave Berg. So he did that one. But that was like pulling teeth. And then I could never get him. And every time we had a special issue like 50th anniversary or number 500, I'd contact him and say, "Hey, can you do just a little spot?" And he said, "No, I just, I don't want to do that kind of stuff because my grandchildren. I got grandchildren." Well, first thing was, I said, "Jack, I want you to draw a picture of a shortstop catching a ball."
Right.
He said, "No, I got grandchildren." His grandchildren were adults by that time. So, I think it was just that as time went on, Jack wanted to ease up, and Mad never made him any money. Not when he was doing movie posters and time covers.
Right.
So
Other advertisements.
it adds, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that he was just being polite, that he really didn't want to do the work anymore. So
Well, can I? I mean, it's the one. It's the one experience. You didn't work. He worked for Mad for 40 years. You worked with him
yeah,
for a piece. So this
yeah,
might be. This might be. To hell. Hell if I know, Giuseppe. Kind of question. But he was incredibly critical of his work. He didn't like what he drew. In fact, he literally
Jack.
said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm very critical of what I draw. After I do something, I'm very disappointed because I want it to look better." Like he wasn't. It wasn't that he thought he wasn't. My shit doesn't stink. It was he thought it stunk.
Well, I think Jack epitomized the commercial illustrator. That he
Right.
he took work on. They were on deadline. He knew that he was being hired because he was Jack Davis and that his clients expected something that looked like Jack Davis. And, he had a very long career. And as time went on, he could really just knock it out. And very often he did. And that's not to criticize him
No.
because Jack was super fast. I mean, I don't know of any illustrator as fast as Jack was, and that was both good and bad because if he knocked something out, it kind of showed, and yet that his knocked out stuff, which contained a lifetime of experience, both personal and professional, in the sense that boy, Jack really knew what he was doing. His use of materials, his understanding of composition, of depth and space,
Hmm.
really, I think, couldn't be equaled.
He's probably in the top five most influential cartoonists in the 20th century. Would you say that?
I, I, I definitely think so. Yeah, and I also think that it extends not simply to style and the art itself, but the business terms. I always said that Jack was my role model as an illustrator. Not that I had any interest at all in mimicking his style, although what I did very often got compared to Jack's, not necessarily flatteringly. But in terms of the career he had, Jack took a cartoon style and he made it a linchpin of
Hmm.
illustration. He
Hmm.
did magazines, he did movie posters, record
Hmm.
albums, advertising, books. There was nothing, trading cards. There was no kind of illustration work that Jack didn't do and didn't excel in. that's the career I wanted. I wanted to be doing movie posters and Time covers. And I also wanted it because people wanted me. They wanted my style.
Right.
Early in my career, there were moments where people would come to me because they would think of me as a second string Jack Davis or Mort Drucker. And they thought, okay, we can get him for cheap. And there was a period where I would go along with that. When
Mm-hmm.
you're starting out, you don't know nothing from nothing. And I mean, even in instances, and there were instances where somebody an ad agency would have a job and they'd say, okay, we don't like the likeness on this person. Could you redraw that face? And I would do it. And at some point I thought, this is bad. This is not a good thing. And I changed my stance to be, okay, if you want to hire me to redo the whole thing in my style at full pay, fine. If not, find somebody else.
Was that a common thing back then? Not for you
I don't
specifically, but
know.
just in general.
I don't know. That's I mean, as I said, it happened to me more than once,
Okay.
but I nipped it. For me, I nipped it in the bud rather early. And I
Yeah.
think here was the issue that in those days, particularly in advertising, illustration was exploding. I'm talking about late 70s, early 80s.
Mm-hmm.
People like Jack were making a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of going back and paying that kind of money for a correction was stuck in the craw of some art directors. And they felt if we can get it done cheaper, and here's a guy, he's a kid, he's still wet behind the ears.
Mm-hmm.
We can get him to do it. And I don't have any anecdotal evidence of other people doing that, but
Yeah.
it happened to me a few times until I said, no, I can't work that
Well,
way. It's
rightfully so.
not yeah. Well, but as I said, you learn as you go along.
Oh, for sure. When I was in college, and this is in the late 90s now, so this is 20 years after all
Hmm.
this stuff is going, we were told by some of our professors, if you can't get work as yourself, try and get work as a second string version of somebody who's incredibly popular, which is why so many of us, me included, probably leaned heavier on like the Brad Holland train than maybe we should have.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, and that's certainly there were certainly people who imitated Jack. There were people
Sure.
I remember who imitated Guy Bu.
A professor of mine in college. He didn't say
Yeah,
he
a
wasn't the guy
lovely
who
guy.
said, "Oh God, Guy Bu is my he's amazing." I had him on the podcast too, and we talked a lot about it. Was weird. He immigrated really quickly. Guy Bu immigrated around the same time as my father.
Uh huh.
Emigrated. I can't tell the difference. You emigrate to a country. I think you immigrate from a country. Whatever. He
I
came.
don't
He
know.
went from France to the United States. My dad
Hmm.
came from Italy to the United States on the same ship.
Wow.
Different trips, though. Not the same trip, but
Okay.
the same
Uh
ship.
huh.
And I think it was Gibiu came first. The ship went back to Italy. It started in Italy. It started in Naples, and then it stopped in France, and then it went to New York. I can't remember which one it was. This episode came out a while ago. It was either my dad came first, the ship came back, picked
Hmm.
up Gibiu, and then came back to New York City, or the other way around. It was a great
Wow.
chat. Gibiu is he's my fave.
Yeah.
Okay, when did you start? Like, I don't want this whole episode to be like, you were an art director at Mad Magazine. Let's talk about that forever. Because there's a lot of other things I want to chat with you about, Sam.
Okay.
Preferably your
Well,
favorite, meatball sauce recipes from your
okay.
own. No, I'm
That's
kidding.
Grandma Di Giuseppe.
Wait, what?
Grandma Di Giuseppe.
What's that?
Best cook who she's my grandmother, Grandma Di Giuseppe. She was the best cook who ever lived.
Wait, her
Period.
last name was Di Giuseppe?
Yes. Well, that was her married name. She was born a Camerata, but she married my grandfather, Sam Di Giuseppe. Salvatore Di Giuseppe.
Are you kidding me?
Not
That's.
at all. No.
I mean, when I emailed you that first time, I mean, did you just see the word Giuseppe and you were like, "What the hell is this? Some kind of prank?"
I was surprised to see somebody American using a fully Italian name
Interesting.
as opposed to Joe. you know?
Well, I used Joe when I was in middle school because the kids made fun of Giuseppe and teased and bullied
Yeah.
Giuseppe. So I was like, well, I'll change it to Joe. And surprise, surprise, they kept teasing and making fun of me and bullying me and stuff. When did you start? Yeah, I'm still unpacking that one. When did you start? When did you inherit your art director job at MAD?
1999, beginning of 1999. After Harvey Kurtzman left MAD and Al Feldstein took over, they brought in John Putnam. John is the person responsible for the look of MAD magazine. When he died in 1980 on a MAD trip, his production guy, Lenny Brenner, who had been with MAD pretty much as long as Putnam had been, since around 1957, took over. And Lenny was art director then from 1980 until around 1995. Now, this brings in all the history of MAD, that when Bill Gaines, the founding publisher of MAD, died in 1992, somebody had to take over the reins. And since MAD belonged to Warner Brothers at the time, and so did DC Comics, the people at DC convinced Warner that they should take over the publishing of MAD. And when they did, they decided that MAD needed to be updated, overhauled, rejuvenated, brought into the 20th century, yada, 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 yada. And they decided that Lenny, who was really, really old school, I mean, Lenny was one of those guys who knew how to cut out tiny little pieces of type and put a wax on it and with tweezers put it down on a mechanical board, eyeballing the whole thing. But he really had only rudimentary skills with computers. And this being the time when computers were starting to make their way into publishing, they felt that they needed to bring in somebody else. So Lenny was retired and made a consultant.
Right.
At any rate, Nick Meglin and John Ficarra, the editors of MAD, were charged with hiring a new art director. And there were some certain mandates put on by the publishers, which was they wanted a name. So
You have a name, right? Sam Viviano.
Well,
Let me just check my
that's
notes.
right.
That's your name.
Yeah, but that is my name, and that's actually that is part of it, because they were looking through the portfolios of lots of art directors, people who had lots of experience supposedly in magazines, and they'd give them little tests to see if they could do MAD kind of stuff, and they just were not happy with anybody. Now I'd been an illustrator for MAD. I'd been working for MAD on a freelance basis for 18 years at that point.
Yep.
I brought a job in one afternoon, and I was chatting with John Ficarra, the co-editor, in his office. I was talking about a period 5 years earlier when he had offered me a kind of bullpen position at MAD, thinking that I could, since I knew computers a little bit more than Lenny, there were things I could do, and I could make corrections and yada, yada, yada. And I had turned him down at that time because I just felt it would totally derail my freelance career. So I'm sitting in his office, and I said, it's too bad you didn't offer me that job now, because the difference between 5 years ago and now is now I have a 4-year-old. And but I wasn't angling for anything, because I in no way had any thought that I would be a candidate to be an art director of anything. In my mind, art directors were primarily designers, and I was primarily a cartoonist, an illustrator.
Yeah.
I could compose a picture, but if I was not particularly skilled with type. I wasn't trained in any way to design printed matter. But I think John thought otherwise.
I'm in John's camp.
Well, yeah, but who knows?
Oh no, it's different. Everything's different. Everybody's different. But I've, in my experience, I was an illustrator that became an art director, and typography was just something I saw as an illustrative element, not necessarily like, oh no, I'm worried I don't know graphic design 101. I learned what kerning was. I learned that, certain typefaces are designed beautifully and others aren't. I mean, these are things you can easily learn as an illustrator. You have an illustrator's eye. You can see that
True.
stuff pretty quickly.
Very
Graphic
true.
designers have a tougher time seeing illustration, I think. I know it's a generalization. Generalization, I know. But anyway, and so throughout my experience, I've always saw and felt and experienced and managed and hired illustrators who became really great designers and then went on to become art directors.
Although, when you look at top line magazines over the years, there aren't a whole lot of art directors who were well known illustrators. The exceptions would be Milton Glaser. Paul Davis had a little stint as an art director,
Nicholas Blechman.
but not a lot. I know Bob Blechman.
Oh, Bob Blechman. He was on the podcast years ago. His son, Nicholas Blechman.
Oh, okay. I assume
believe,
they had to be relation.
Yeah, I don't know what his exact title is at the New Yorker. It might be something like creative director or something, but he's quite a designer and he's also an incredible illustrator. So,
well, there you go. Yeah.
There's a couple, but you're right. You're right.
It's not unknown. Yeah, I mean, it's not something that occurred to me. So I was actually taken aback when John called me the next morning, and he said, "How'd you like to be art director?" No, how'd you like to audition for art director? Mm-hmm. No, would you like to take a test? It was, how'd you like to be art director? And I think he saw it as a perfect answer to his problem, which was, I knew MAD. I understood the culture. Let's put it that way. I was part of the culture.
Would you refer to yourself as the what is it? The team of idiots? What is it called?
Usual gang of idiots.
That's the one.
Oh yeah. By that time, I was definitely part of that. And while we kind of designate anybody who ever does anything for MAD as part of the usual gang of idiots, it's really a slightly tighter group, and you have to kind of pay your dues.
What if you interview a member of the usual gang of idiots? What does that make you?
I see.
I'm asking for a friend, Sam.
Let's say honorary idiot. How's that?
I'll take it.
You put me on the spot here.
I'll take it.
You put me on the spot. Anyhow, the other. I mean, within the MAD world, I was obviously a name because I had credits for years.
I mean, you're Sam Viviano, for God's sakes.
Well, yeah, I'm okay. I'll take it. And
does that bother you?
While I, on one hand, have a career I can look back on with a great amount of pride and satisfaction. In my mind, I never really quite achieved the level that I aspired to, and that was partially due to the times. There already was a Jack Davis, there already was a Mort Drucker, and I was the next generation. So in some ways, I was emulating them as opposed to, creating something in the same way that they kind of created genres of illustration and cartooning. I was pretty solid, pretty good at what I did, but I don't know that I necessarily ever got that one thing that made people just kind of, knock their socks off. So
maybe not.
I developed this sense of that I'm a solid professional, I'm a working Joe, and when I do get compliments, it's lovely. Who doesn't like to be complimented? But it's very difficult to kind of justify what somebody might be saying to my own self-image. Okay,
you're an artist. That's why.
I've been told. I have been told that I'm too humble, and my response is always, I have a lot to be humble about.
I'm stealing that.
So
Sam.
I tell you, I mean, like I mentioned Steve Brodner to you earlier,
sure.
or I happened to go to a panel and that included Peter de Sève and Anita Kunz and Blitt.
Podcast guest, podcast
Peter I've
guest.
known for many years.
Yeah.
But, I also feel that somehow, much as I wanted to, I never quite rose to that level. Fortunately, in terms of personal interactions, people are not assessing your heights in the business world, in the industry, in the profession.
Yeah.
But you know,
I know.
you're getting the deep dark psychology out of me now.
Oh, Sam.
That
Well, look, man, I get it. Congratulations, Sam. I don't know if anyone's ever told you this, but you're an illustrator. You're an artist. I
no,
think this is
that
a
part I know.
yeah, okay. Well, then you know that it's incredibly common for artists to feel this way. I talk to illustrators every single day, 5, 6, 7 times a day. And this comes
Oh, wow.
up more than you think, more than you hope. I mean, you hope that it doesn't come up, but it comes up a lot. People just feel like no matter what it is that they do, no matter how many awards they get, no matter how much praise they receive, that they're just don't feel like they feel their own self-assessment is more accurate than others. So, which is valid and may be true, may not be true. Or B, psychologically, there's something in there that just doesn't want to dislodge, that's keeping them from feeling like they deserve it. And maybe time
Well, two things.
Yeah.
Okay, two things. One is,
Yeah.
first of all, unlike performing arts, unlike even other things like when I worked at MAD, I was working in a community. We had a little family there.
Sure.
Illustrators and cartoonists, for the most part, work all by themselves.
Yep.
My image of my career as an illustrator is sitting in my underwear at 4 a.m. trying to meet yesterday's dedeadline. So
That's
you do
must-see
have a
television right
few-
there, is what that is.
You're never going to be able to unsee that now. But it does give you a skewed perception because
Yeah, I
you're
getcha.
working in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Okay. And the second aspect of this is you have to be self-critical, I think. You mentioned Jack Davis, how Jack never felt, he's very, very harsh on himself. Well, if you ever do something and say, hey, perfect, there's no reason to ever do anything else again, ever.
Of course.
You've hit the heights. You've reached nirvana. That's not an honest assessment either, because no matter how good anything you do is, the next one you can aspire to, at least making better.
And that's
And
the
that's
beauty.
what really drives, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're on the same page.
Yeah,
on
I
that.
agree.
That's how exciting is that?
Yeah.
I mean, there are very few, I was going to say careers. I guess you could say careers, but ways to pass the time. Very few endeavors in one's life. I feel like, are there other places, like could you be a better plumber? Can you be a better mechanic? Sure, you could be more efficient and, things like that. But there's like something about art. I mean, the next piece you do could be like a quantum leap better than anything you've ever done. You could tap into something you haven't yet tapped into, or it could be shittier.
Well, but that's it. Yeah. Oh God, yes. Yeah,
you could
definitely
literally
could be
forget. You can
shittier.
literally say to yourself, I think I've forgotten how to paint. Which
that happened to me all the time. All the time. I would wake up in the morning and said, I don't know how to draw anymore. And I'd waste an entire day and then, have to kind of start fresh the next day.
Yeah, and then you have a glass of wine at night.
Sure, it happened
and then
all the
just
time.
Go back to bed. Yeah,
Yeah.
figure it out the next day. I
Yeah.
guess here's what I like. Here's what I like about what we're talking about. Like isn't the right word either, but whatever, I'll say it. What I think is important about what we're talking about here is that it reveals and reminds and highlights and underlines, italicizes, whatever, former art director to former art director, the importance of like realizing that I don't care who we're talking about. It could be someone who's just starting out. It could be someone whose name is Sam Viviano. We could be talking about Jack Davis. We could be talking about whoever we're talking about. Norman Mingo. There's nothing wrong with you if you're not feeling it. If you feel like you're in some kind of a losing streak or you're not feeling like you're where you need to be, These kinds of things are incredibly real. Let me give you two examples. We're bringing up, I mean, obviously there are plenty more idiots out there, but let's just stick to Norman Mingo and Jack Davis.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like they decided to be an illustrator and then they just became one and then became the illustrator. Norman Mingo didn't invent Alfred E. Neuman, but he essentially visualized it for everybody. I mean, we know what he looks like now because of Norman Mingo, right? Am I wrong?
Right.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
But he started his career. His career was derailed twice in the very beginning. He started off and then World War I. So he served for the U.S. Navy during World War I. Then he tried it again, and then it's the Depression. It wasn't easy, let's put it that way. And then he had a studio, he had to close it. Then came Mad. But Norman, this was like in the 50s now. Like Norman Mingo didn't start his career, like he didn't become the Norman Mingo we now know. What am I trying to say? He wasn't the Norman Mingo we now study and now talk about in his 20s. His career really took off in his 60s.
Right.
Am I wrong there?
Well, you seem to know more about Mingo than I do. He's one of the few Mad guys I never had the chance to meet because he too died in 1980, just before I started working for Mad. But I knew that he had a long career as an illustrator before he came to Mad, and he was essentially on the verge of retirement, and he saw a tiny classified ad in the New York Times looking for a cover artist.
Yep.
This is what would establish him for all time as the guy who took all these references to the idiot boy that went back to the mid-19th century and coalesced them all into the archetypal Alfred E. Neuman.
He did more than 90 Mad magazine covers.
Oh, what was that?
What's that? Can you hear me?
Something going on. I'm hearing a very garbled, high-pitched voice. Sounds like Donald Duck.
Oh my gosh. What about now?
I don't know what it is. No, I'm still getting Donald Duck.
That's so weird.
Maybe we should hang up and call back, or...
Yeah, go ahead. Do that. Hang up and then call back.
Okay.
This podcast is produced by the Illustration Department, a global leader in online education for illustrators. Visit illustrationdept.com for offerings like mentorships and portfolio reviews, testimonials, our alumni showcase, our best-selling Substack, and more. That's illustrationdept.com. And now, back to our conversation. I thought for a minute, using this new program, recording podcast episodes, like this was the first time where everything seemed to be working just exactly the way I needed it to work. No computer fan humming. It was like we were on it, man. And then that happened. I don't know what's going on. How's it working on your iPad but not on your phone? I mean, what's the difference? Doesn't seem to make any sense.
The one, yeah, and the only other difference is it's a widescreen image of me as opposed to a vertical image.
Which I'm not even recording that part.
Right.
I'm not even. Yeah. In fact, I literally, because I don't want my fan to turn on here, I close that window so I don't even see you. All I'm seeing are my notes, and I try to keep. I've turned off every program. See, Sam, this is what I'm talking about, man. Just. Is it good enough? Is it where it needs to be to communicate what I'm trying to communicate? If the answer is yeah, I'm just not going to let this kind of stuff bother me. It used to bother me a lot. I used to sweat. I'm like, I'm talking to Sam Viviano, for God's sake, and then all this glitchy bull crap happens. And it used to really bother me, but it just doesn't anymore. And I don't know where that's coming from. And since this is not psychology hour, let's get to what we're talking about, which is essentially like bottom line here is, look, I don't care if you're Jack Davis, who started that big chapter of his life, started in his 60s. He was an illustrator before that, but he was, like you said, he was thinking about retiring, and then he answers an ad. Next thing you know,
you're talking about Norman Mingo, not Jack Davis.
Yeah, Norman Mingo. Thank you. See, I'm all discombobulated. And then you got Jack Davis, who he too.
Well, the same thing happened to Jack,
right? Until Bill Gaines showed up.
Not even that. Because, he was doing comic books and he had the EC comic books gave him a certain conscripted level of fame, comic book kids
Right.
and top baseball cards. The thing that changed his life was It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, because he had been doing this stuff, none of which paid very well. And somebody doing a movie poster said, "Why don't we get that guy from Mad Magazine?" Suddenly, he was the biggest illustrator there was. It led to so many other movie posters, and then Time Magazine. If there was a period where he was doing a Time Magazine cover every month practically.
Right.
That's what I was kind of talking about earlier. There was never that one thing that kind of catapulted me to another level. And, I think that's probably the case for most people in the business. There are only a small number of Jack Davises, really.
Well, that's the other thing
Only
too.
one,
Is
as a matter of fact.
right. I mean, again, this is something that I got hung up on, and I've learned my way out of it, and just sort of grew my way out of it, which was I want the podcast to be a certain way. I want it to sound a certain way, and I want to get. I mean, I even applied speaking of awards, I won Communication Arts Award once and an award from the Society of Illustrators once, and I was out. I'm out. I got it. 1 and 1.
Yeah, right.
I'm out. I don't need to submit it again. I can say, award winning, etc. However, for the podcast, I've submitted the podcast to podcast awards and haven't gotten any luck there. And this is a couple of years ago when I thought like I could, and now I'm like, I don't give a shit, dude. I'm out on that too. It doesn't matter to me. I guess all I'm trying to say here though is, to your point earlier, I think the best thing to do is to not stress too much about that. And I'm not talking to you, Sam, obviously. I'm talking to the listener. Is don't stress too much about that. Just like the best award is to continue working, to get
exactly.
work. And not get too hung up on, being the this or the that or the award winning such and such.
This kind of harkens back to our conversation a little earlier. Is I'm not particularly comfortable with self-aggrandizement. This kind of constant effort to show how great I am and how it used to be I'd take an ad or two in a trade directory like the Black Book or American Showcase and that would do the work for promoting myself, and hopefully the work itself would promote me. But the idea of I know people who do blogs, and of course now it's Substack. Everybody's doing Substack, and
I'm doing Substack.
And I admire you for it, and I admire my friends who do it and do it well. But that in and of itself seems like a full-time job. And when you start layering on the other things, like what you're doing, a podcast, and I have several other friends who are doing podcasts, It's like, what do you have time for anything else? My old career in the late 70s and 80s and the 90s, I would say about 70% of it was actually sitting at the board and doing the work. Of the other 30%, most of that was devoted to picking up and delivering the jobs. Because
I remember
back
those
in
days.
the day, those are the great days. I loved it. I mean, my favorite part of a job was delivering it, hopefully to get a really good reaction from the art director, and also to spend a little time schmoozing with them, because I'd spent that other 70% of my time all alone in my underwear at 4 o'clock in the morning.
I came in right at the end of that. My first couple of years in book publishing, part of my job was going around New York City and delivering art to, like, in the reverse. I would return art to, if they didn't want to come to the office, I would go to them. I'd go to their studios, I'd go to their apartments and drop off art.
Yeah.
I get this question, particularly in the editorial space. The sort of consensus is, quote unquote, editorial's dead.
Mm-hmm.
It's not dead. It's just not the same. It's not
Sure.
as
Okay.
much. It's still there.
Yeah.
In its place are other opportunities that didn't exist in the 80s and the 90s. And I find it funny, like the 40s was the golden age. J.C. Leyendecker literally had a house in, I think it was Ryebeck or Rye or wherever the heck he was. There were plenty of super duper rich, Jesse Wilcox Smith made, something like $1 million a year in today's money. It was ridiculous.
Yeah.
But that was the golden age. It is the golden age of illustration. But then I think any decade, you can look back 2 or 3 decades and go, gosh, those were the days, weren't they?
Yeah.
People in the 90s were going, gosh, the 60s and the 70s were the days. Nowadays, we're looking at the 80s and 90s going, gosh, those were the days. In 20, 30 years, mark my words, in 20 years, we're going to look back on today, I promise you, and say, gosh, those were the days. Because maybe in 20 years, there will be another shift. And I don't think it's going to be AI, but maybe it's something related to that. I don't know. But do you see what I'm trying to get at here? I feel every generation of illustrator looks back 30 years and goes, I wish I was working 30 years ago.
Oh, yeah, sure. No, I think, hey, listen, I think it would have been harder for me to have the career I had 20 years earlier or 30 years earlier, because by the time I came around, people like Jack Davis had made cartoon illustration a more legitimate part of illustration in general.
Right.
Not
Plus
that
it was simpler too, right? By the time you came around, there was 4-color printing. You didn't have to worry about pre-separation.
Yeah, although, there's still a much more mechanical aspect to it than after the digital age came in.
Right.
I did plenty of separations in the early days because you do things that were 2-color posters,
Yeah.
So
I get you.
Yeah, I think you're right. We always tend to look at the past in a nostalgic haze, anyhow. In any context, whether it's our profession or our lives or culture, government, etc. But what it also means, the years I worked for MAD, there was this concern that circulation's going down. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't anything we were doing. I think we were still putting out a pretty solid product.
Sure.
But the audience was changing, because the things that drove kids to MAD in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, they were now going to video games, and they were now going to internet. And as time went on, they were going to social media. And they were things that we could try to buy into or try to compete with, but the fact was that we were a print magazine. First of all, a lot of things that we did in print really didn't translate well into social media, for instance, like movie parodies, and we were not really equipped and certainly didn't have the resources to do things like animation. And I do remember my editor saying, I wonder if we're just making a really, really good buggy whip. And I don't know if you're familiar with that analogy, but it was one he used a lot. That once upon a time, making buggy whips was a thriving industry, but eventually there wasn't a whole lot of need for buggy whips.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced that we're seeing the decline of editorial. I just, again, I'm talking from I'm kind of looking out. I'm standing around it. What I'm trying to say, I'm standing on the outside looking in, and I don't work in editorial day to day. So I take this with a grain of salt. But I just there's I don't know. There's something about absolutes that I never buy into, and to say that editorial's dead or this and that, it just doesn't compute.
No, I don't argue with that, and somebody who's kind of based his whole life, really, not just a career, but my life on print. And for me, it was not just that. It was just being in love with print. And I
Yeah.
remember we visit relatives' houses. I'd make a beeline for their den to see what magazines they had in the because everyone's subscribing to magazines then, and they'd have the ones that we didn't have in our house. Whether it was McCall's or Ladies' Home Journal or Life or and I loved turning the pages. I loved looking at the pictures, and when it was illustrated, it would be even that much better. But it was the whole experience. That's an experience you don't get looking at a screen, and
Uh-huh.
it's very possible. It's very possible that just as vinyl LPs have made an odd kind of comeback over the last 10 years, that
Hmm.
print matter will make a comeback too because it offers an experience you really don't get in any other medium.
Sam, that's the camp I've been in for a while now. I would not be
Yeah.
surprised in the slightest if print finds its way back in maybe not the exact same way, and it won't be the exact same way, but there will be a greater appreciation, and not just from like aficionados and people who are more in the culturalista groups, but I'm saying just the general folks are like, God, I'd love to just sit down and read a magazine, put it down, and then that's it. I don't have to
Yeah.
scroll for an hour, or further damage my eyes and my attention span and spike my dopamine hits. Just sit down with a magazine, or sit down with something in print. I don't know. My bold prediction is we're going to see over the next 5 or 10 years a re-embracing. Does that make sense? Yeah, it makes sense to me. Of print. We'll get there. I'm
Well,
not worried. What, me worry?
I mean, obviously, I'll be kind of looking from the outside in at that point. But
Yeah.
one of the things that gave Mad its longevity was that it wasn't really ephemera, even though we always classify print matter and magazines in particular as ephemera. Kids would read it and they'd save them,
Oh, for
partially
sure.
because
Sure.
they were artifacts, but also you're a bright 12, 13-year-old kid, you're reading Mad, and you get maybe 2/3 of the jokes, and there's a third that they're above your head, because the thing that made Mad was that the writers were not really writing down to their perceived 12-year-old audience.
Yeah.
They were basically writing to make Bill Gaines laugh. They were writing because they made themselves laugh. And
Hmm.
and I remember reading Mad, wondering, why are there all these articles about divorce? Well, it was because they were all getting divorced. All the writers and artists were getting divorced at that time. They wrote and drew what they knew.
That's hilarious.
In a larger context where they're addressing geopolitical issues. I'm 12 years old. I don't know who Tito is. So I put the magazine on the shelf, and 6 months later, a year later, I pick it up. Oh, now I get it. That was really
Yeah.
one of the superpowers of Mad, was that it it allowed kids to evolve with it.
Sure.
I was the kind that I didn't just put Mad on the shelf. I collected magazines. There was a period I had thousands and thousands of magazines in my basement, and the biggest problem was when I went away to college. What happened? Well, I left them in the basement. Then my parents got divorced, and the house was sold. What do you do with all of them? I had to get rid of a lot of magazines.
Yeah. Ugh, that's heartbreaking.
It was heartbreaking.
Yeah.
For a while, my dad stored them in his garage, and I had boxes and boxes of old Life magazines
Mm.
and
Hmm.
God, all sorts of other. And he called me up one day and said, I have to get rid of the magazines. He said, why? My garage is sinking.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so I said, okay, Dad, do one thing for me. Save one box. It can be just a random assortment, just as a kind of,
Yeah.
memento
Sure.
of this short lifetime of having been a magazine collector. And I still have a few boxes of old magazines. They're in storage. and I know that at some point I'm just going to have to dump them.
I wouldn't, Sam. I wouldn't. Here's what. Let me tell you
Well,
why. Let me tell you why. You're right about the whole vinyl record thing. Obviously, it's pretty obvious. I think it's pretty generally accepted knowledge now that vinyls are back. Again, not as back as not exactly the way they used to be.
right,
But now
right,
because they can't. They're competing with all these other formats. But you get my point.
right. Yeah.
My father-in-law in his attic had a bunch of boxes of old vinyls. And again, my mother-in-law passed, and over the next couple of years, he's cleaning out his house. Texting all his children and children's-in-law. Hey, do you want this bowl? Hey, do you want this thing? Hey, do you want this thing? So he's clearing out his house, and we're all telling him, why are you doing this, man? You have plenty of life left to live. You need all these things. He's like, no, I don't really need all this stuff, and you guys can take it. That way, when I die, you don't have to worry about it. Which is kind of macabre, but I kind of get what he's trying to get at. Anyway, my point
Sure.
is, one day we're down at his house, and it's one of those, take whatever you're seeing, take it. I don't need it. So I go into his attic, and there's a bunch of boxes of records. And I said, hey, do you mind if I grab these? He's like, oh, well, what are you going to do with it? Well, we have a record player. You do? Yeah. Yeah, sure, take them. I was going to throw them out anyway. So I take them, pull them out, and show them to my wife, and every single record. She's just like, oh, I remember when my dad was laying on the ground when I was 5 and he was listening to this, Peter, Paul and Mary record. Oh my gosh, here's a Cat Stevens that reminds me of my mom. And there are all of these, it's not just records. It's mementos of memory.
Yep.
I guess that's redundant, mementos of memory.
They're Madeleines.
So try not to remove. And by the way, if, next couple of years you decide I'm getting rid of these magazines, text me. I will drive to your home and pick those sons of bitches up and bring them back to my house.
Well, they're not all in particularly great condition.
I don't care.
Concerned with that.
Sam, yeah. I'm not in great condition.
I might very well do that, Giuseppe, because the alternative generally to throwing out is selling. And, the eBay proposition has no appeal to me, where I have to... I have to put it up, and then
Sam, I am 2 hours away by car, so just say the word, and I'll take that. And if there's any artwork on the walls, I'll take those too. I mean, I don't know if you have like an original Jack Unruh or somebody, but I'll grab that. I'll grab that off your wall.
Not Unruh. I do have some original Jack Davises.
Did you take when you were an art director? Did you ever? Were you able to did illustrators sort of gift you the illustrations, or did they ever say, "Oh, you don't have to send it back to me," or anything like that? Were you able to
occasionally
procure a piece?
Happened.
Okay.
Yeah, I have what you might call a very small collection of
same
comic art and mad art, and most of it, the vast majority, are from the people I worked with. Yeah, there were occasions where somebody, and it wasn't usually like an entire job, it might be a page.
Yeah.
And it depended on the artist. Like Paul Coker, and I absolutely adore Paul Coker. I don't know how familiar you are, but I always felt he was one of the undersung mad artists, partially because he didn't really have a signature feature, but just a great cartoonist with such an idiosyncratic style. I worked with Paul right to the very end of our years at Mad, and he was already, I think, in his 90s at that point. He finally told me that he said, "Don't call me anymore, please." But Paul was talk about humble. If I ever said, "Oh, I really like that job, Paul," he'd say, "Oh, why don't you keep it?"
Yeah.
Originally, Bill Gaines kept all of the mad art. Eventually sold it off at auction. When he died, one of the first things that Nick Meglin and John Ficarra did was decide that artwork should be returned to the artists. And a number of artists really it helped them out because they were able to sell their original art after that. In my case, it's all in storage somewhere. But so we returned the art, and in fact, the last month and a half or so that I was in the office was spent returning art because it was always the weakest part of my duties as art director, because you'd be so involved with actually getting the magazine out
Right.
that I didn't have enough time to return the art. So I spent a lot of time at the end returning art, and that's actually when a couple of these events happened where I said, I've been living with this piece for so long, and I would. Is there any way that you would see to let me have it? And occasionally I would buy them,
Yeah.
and there was one really poignant moment for me. There was a piece that Mort Drucker had done for a Mad special in 1969.
Hmm.
It was Mad specials would usually have some kind of special feature tipped in, stamps or well, all kinds of records. And in this case, it was Mad's Nasty Cards, and it was 12 greeting cards that you would send to people you didn't like, and they would have these nasty little poems written by Frank Jacobs, and each one was illustrated by a different artist, a different Mad guy,
Yeah.
and about a half of them were in the drawers in our flat files. And I don't know why they were still sitting there. But the new policy was that we would return any old stuff that was hanging around to the artist, and a
Hmm.
number of them were gone.
Right.
So I called his daughter, Lori. I said, there's this piece of your dad's that I've been living. I would love to buy it from him. And she said, okay, what I want you to do is I want you to give it to me. I'm going to be seeing my dad this weekend, and I'll see. Because Mort lived out in Long Island.
Yeah.
She called me back a couple of days later. I said, well, he wants you to have it, but he doesn't want you to pay. But it's going to take him a little bit of time because he wants to sign it to you. He wants to write something to you.
Oh my
So,
gosh.
yeah. And so
Hmm.
he wrote something to Sam, the best art editor, or something like that. Love Mort Drucker. So that's on my wall. That's a piece that has a very special personal meaning to me.
Yeah. Amazing. There's
Yeah.
this great quote from Michael J. Fox. He was interviewed in the mid 1980s by Johnny Carson. Johnny Carson asks Michael J. Fox, well, how do you know, because Michael J. Fox's star was rising at that point. He's like, how do you know that you made it? And Michael J. Fox said, when Mort Drucker drew my head.
Well, that story circulated around the Mad offices forever. We would always tell that story, and I only knew about it, second, third hand until the Johnny Carson Enterprises started putting things up that you could actually on the internet access. And I found that piece, and I actually saw that moment where he said that,
Yeah.
and I was just really taken by it.
Yeah.
About
Kind of awesome.
15 years ago, we were doing a series of books called Mad's Greatest Artists, where we do a compilation of stuff. And
Hmm.
we did one for Sergio Aragonés, and
Oh
I think
yeah.
we started out with Don Martin, and
How
we
many how
decided
many
to
how many pieces does Sergio do for Mad? Something like in the thousands.
I had like a billion,
Yeah, there it is.
and he's still working for Mad now. He may be the only person who's worked for Mad for over 60 years.
Wow.
There were at one point there were a dozen who had been working for Mad for over 50 years.
Right. I mean, we can go on and on and on about Mad, but let's acknowledge that it certainly is a mad world, especially these days. In spite of all of that, what piece of advice, what last word of wisdom, a little bit of insight, what would you like to say to illustrators listening to this from you to them?
In spite of whatever happens in the industry, whether print is dying or not, whether opportunities are minimizing or not, ultimately any art of any sort is not really something you choose. I think it chooses you. I've always told younger artists that you don't get into this business to make a lot of money because the chances are not on your side. You do it because you have to do it. You do it because there's something inside you that would rupture if you didn't give it its proper due.
Yeah.
So that's really it. Is you do it because you have to do it. It's in the worst way, I guess, it's a kind of compulsion. In the best way, it makes your life special. It makes your life fuller. So that's the advice is if you got to do it, you got to allow yourself to do it. And that's in spite of parents or guidance counselors or friends or mentors saying, there's not much of a career there. Maybe you should set your horizons broader and make sure you get a good education and stuff. Good education, important, yes. But if you feel that urge and you need to do it, you got to do it.
Sam can be found on Instagram. If you find value in this podcast, you can support it by subscribing to my best-selling Substack. For $5 a month or $50 a year, you will access hundreds of articles on the art, practice, and history of illustration, unlock bonus podcast episodes called Extra Credit, and connect with other members of the ID community. Join me on Substack by visiting illustrationdept.substack.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.